Hey guys, welcome. It's Nancy here from the Health Stack. Today we're going to continue on with our conversation about those 2 or 3 a.m. wakings where you're lying there wishing that you could sleep. Maybe your heart's racing, maybe you're having some anxiety and you're wondering why suddenly your sleep has completely fallen apart. So in this video, we're going to further break down some of the things that are happening within your body and your brain as we're entering midlife, particularly for women, but it can impact men as well. So as we discussed in our last video, we were looking at particularly the role of progesterone. So as we know that our hormones start to fluctuate wildly and our estrogen is kind of being super erratic in the beginning and then will drop off pretty much altogether. And our progesterone is doing kind of a linear decline, and that can have a real impact on the quality and quantity of our sleep. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on the role of some other hormones and things called neurotransmitters that also can impact our sleep. So we're going to start this discussion off looking at the role of serotonin. Now, so serotonin is a neurotransmitter which works in our bodies very similar to a hormone. It's basically like a messenger that signals our bodies to do certain things. And serotonin is what we call our happy hormone. So it really impacts our mood, our calmness factor, our calmness level, our happiness. So what we find is that when people have low serotonin, it really disrupts their mood, and that's when people tend to get depressed, and they get put on often what's called an SSRI, which impacts their serotonin levels. But what we don't often talk about is the role that estrogen and serotonin have working together. And even though they have very different jobs in the body, their interaction actually really does have a big impact, and particularly on our serotonin, but also what we're going to talk about later downstream from that and how it affects our sleep. So serotonin and estrogen, they do have different purposes, but what we do know is that estrogen has a strong influence on serotonin, and that's mainly in 3 ways. And it's not super important that we understand all these mechanisms, but just so that you know, estrogen can actually enhance the production of serotonin, and it does this by upregulating or encouraging the expression of certain enzymes that help with serotonin synthesis. So when we don't have estrogen, or estrogen isn't reliable like it used to be when we were premenopausal, then we can't rely on that enzyme always being produced. So when we have estrogen, we have more of that enzyme, and that enzyme helps with making or synthesizing the serotonin. Estrogen also affects the density, so like per square centimeter, or however you want to measure it, the number of receptors to serotonin. So the more receptors there are, the more your body can use the serotonin. So estrogen also helps upregulate, like if you imagine a satellite, upregulate the serotonin receptors so that more serotonin can be taken in by your body. And thirdly, estrogen can help reduce or inhibit the breakdown of serotonin. So that means serotonin will last longer in your brain when we have more estrogen. And so when estrogen starts to be a little bit erratic or it starts to drop off, then those 3 things are going to impact the amount of serotonin that we have. And so that definitely explains why a lot of women, when their estrogen drops, their mood can also drop. So we can see that there's a pretty direct correlation between our serotonin production and our mood. Now, what does this have to do with sleep? I'm sure that you're asking. So serotonin is actually what we call a precursor. So it's one of the building blocks that we need to make melatonin. Now, if you don't know much about melatonin, melatonin is what we know as our sleep hormone. It's produced in the pineal gland in our brain, and it responds to levels of light and darkness that are optic nerve signals to our brain. So when it starts to get dark outside, our brain signals the pineal gland to release melatonin, and the melatonin doesn't necessarily induce sleep, but what it does is it signals, like all hormones, they're signalers. It signals the different parts of your body to get ready to come to the sleep start line. So things like your body temperature has to drop in order for you to go to sleep. Your blood pressure will drop. Your brain activity will start to slow. So basically melatonin is going around your body saying, all right, it's getting that time. Everyone get ready. We're going to be going to sleep soon because our eyes are noticing that it's starting to get dark. But what we notice is that women, when they get into menopause, this seems to be disrupted. This cycle tends to be disrupted. Now, our melatonin tends to it kind of kicks in a couple of hours before we want to go to sleep, and it peaks in the middle of the night. Guess what time? Between 2 and 4 a.m. generally, which is right when we tend to be waking up. As middle-aged women, we tend to have that 2 or 3 o'clock awakening. And so basically, if our melatonin is low, then that can really impact that sleep cycle, where we're relying on a peak of melatonin to keep our bodies in that sleep state, especially things like night sweats and hot flashes, when our body temperatures are no longer responding to that melatonin signal. So basically, what we have to be thinking about is that if we want to have enough melatonin, we definitely want to make sure we have enough serotonin. And so if we're missing out, and unfortunately, women already are behind the 8 ball when it comes to serotonin, and they produce about 50% less, or they synthesize 50% less serotonin just generally than their male counterparts do. So we're a little bit at a disadvantage already. And then we get a drop in estrogen or an erratic level of estrogen, and that can really impact the amount of serotonin, which then equates to impacting the amount of melatonin that we have. Now, even to back this further upstream, so we know serotonin is important, but what we need to remember is that serotonin has to be synthesized in our bodies. And one of the ways that's done is it really requires a sufficient amount of an amino acid, an essential amino acid known as tryptophan. Now, tryptophan is essential, and that means that we have to get it through our diet. So our bodies don't naturally produce tryptophan. We have to take it in ourselves, like through our diet. So tryptophan turns into serotonin, serotonin turns into melatonin. So we have to make sure that we're eating properly, making sure we have good sufficient amounts of tryptophan. We are making sure we get some sunlight for our serotonin. Our gut health is where a lot of serotonin is also created. And then we can also, if need be, if we're still feeling like maybe our melatonin levels are just not quite right, there are possibilities to supplement with melatonin. However, a lot of the kind of commercial, what you would buy in a pharmacy for melatonin, their doses are far, far too high. Our bodies only produce a tiny amount, and you probably only need like even half of a 1 milligram tablet. You don't need a lot, and there's not a lot of evidence saying that more will help improve your sleep more. You really only need a threshold amount, and once you have that amount, the rest is not really, it's not going to be beneficial necessarily. So some of the tips that we just talked about, so eating a diet rich in foods that have tryptophan, so turkey, chicken, eggs, salmon, pumpkin seeds, oats, dairy, bananas. And then you want to try and pair that with some good complex carbohydrates, because the complex carbohydrates will help the tryptophan to cross across the blood-brain barrier, so it can get into your brain where we want it. All right, morning sunlight will help set your circadian rhythm. It helps set you up with some serotonin first thing in the morning. Making sure you're dimming the light at night to make sure that your brain is signaling for the melatonin that you're producing to release. So the bright lights on your screen, the bright overhead lights in your bedroom, TV, all of those things are signaling that it's daytime. So that's really counterproductive. So when you hear people talking about sleep hygiene and they say get off your devices, that's part of the reason why. It's because your body's getting a mixed message about whether it's nighttime or not. And so that will slow down or stop the release of melatonin. And we're getting that 3 a.m. waking because the melatonin is not peaking when it's meant to. The other thing to think about is to really manage your stress. Okay, so your serotonin and your melatonin are really closely connected to your cortisol levels as well. There was a recent study done that showed they tested 2 groups, a control group and a group of meditators. And the meditators had substantially higher serotonin and melatonin levels in their blood tests. So that's just one more thing that you could be thinking about. In addition, that also helps your progesterone levels. So that's also another added bonus for helping your sleep. So if sleep is something that you're really struggling with, it's not just in your head, there are biochemical reasons for these things to happen. And there's some solutions that you can try and see if it helps solve this problem for you. All right, guys, take care. Subscribe below and like the video if it's offered you anything helpful today.